woman's dream. Lucky Charlotte, can you believe what she inherited?
Yes, I have a fairy godmother who will bequeath you the world's largest collection of vintage haute couture. I'm so jealous.
Vintage Chanel, vintage Dior.
Yes, and I mean, what a great book it was too. All the illustrations were beautiful of the gowns at Charlotte Smith's One Enchanted Evening.
I loved all the stories. I love the fact that it shows fashion is part of a woman's life, a part of how she creates herself and how she expresses herself.
Yes, and I also think it's one of the more beautiful things about being human is to be able to express yourself creatively through the clothes you wear, the house that you live in, all those sorts of things.
And one of the things I was most intrigued by is how her Quaker godmother ended up with this amazing collection of clothes. I can't wait to ask her. So this afternoon for Charlotte Smith, I'm going to be making a beautiful high tea. I'm going to be preparing classic old-fashioned cucumber sandwiches and some beautiful chicken sandwiches with rocket and mayonnaise. And then we're going to be baking some scones, which are the most delicious old-fashioned English tea that you can imagine. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So, the classic recipes for high tea is of course the cucumber sandwich, and so we're going to be making cucumber sandwiches today. I got my recipe from the Ashmolean Museum where they do a fantastic high tea. I go there in Oxford every year, and so I asked them for the recipe, and that's what I'm going to be making for Charlotte Smith today. And then I'm also going to be making a classic chicken sandwich as well. Sarah, come help me make some sandwiches. Hey honey.
Hey honey, how's it going?
Oh, I'm loving this kitchen.
I know, it's beautiful, isn't it? It belongs to a friend of mine, Rachel. She has a styling business up here called Colour on Location, and so yeah, it was really nice of her to lend it to us when we said we were filming up here.
Well, it's perfect because I didn't want to have to make all my sandwiches and scones in Sydney, then drive all the way up here.
Yeah.
With them in the car. So thank you, Rachel.
Yes, thanks Rachel.
So if you could just butter the bread and,
Okay.
and just butter it really smoothly and from crust to crust. So now I'm going to make some English-style scones, which I hope will be lovely and fluffy and light. To make that happen, I'm adding 4 teaspoons of bicarb soda to my flour and just giving that a quick mix through. I have 2 cups of whole flour in here, and I'm just going to dip it into my bowl, and then I add 6 tablespoons of butter. And I want to rub the butter through the flour. It almost looks like breadcrumbs once it's done. Now just adding the sugar and just a couple of pinches of salt as well. Mixing those through. Add the milk to it. Give it a quick little whisk. And then, a secret my mum always told me was to make a well in the flour mixture, and then you pour the egg and the milk in very carefully.
To see you. Thank you. Lovely to see you, and you're looking beautifully, appropriately dressed for this cold winter's day. Come in. Thank you. And my dog said, through.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Oh, what an amazing house. I love it.
Thank you. Well, we've been here 7 years, almost 20 years to the day. I moved here because I'd met an Australian in England, moved over. He said he lived in the Blue Mountains. He also told me that there was only 3 months of cold weather in Australia. He didn't tell me that it was up in the Blue Mountains. It was not the same story. So I've been here since then. But I mean, what I love is, we have these big windows because the house was built in 1951. So we have these big windows and you can look out and you can tell what season it is by the color of the leaves of the trees outside the window.
And those metal windows, they're quite unusual.
Yeah, well,
These days,
apparently they're 1950s. Yeah, and this is my dog Sydney. So just to remind us where we live in Australia, we call our dog Sydney.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah,
Little Westie.
So we'll be waiting patiently for Pat. So I just want to say, I love your artwork. That painting over there is just exquisite. And I love this one up here.
That's actually Robert Malherbe. He's a local artist from Blackheath, and he actually did this portrait of me. That was a few years ago. Everything else is a bit eclectic.
Look, I mean, you've got beautiful little collections of things.
Yeah.
Look, I love this little table here with the little
my little
Westie, and
I know.
it feels like there's a story behind everything that you own.
And you know what, I remember someone told me once, like how she said to me after looking at all my beautiful things, she said, how can you stand traveling around with all of this baggage? She called it baggage. And I looked at her and I thought, I don't get what you're talking about, because to me it's not baggage, because it's exactly what you say, it's about stories. I walk into many houses and it's very sterile. And I think, for me, that's why my fashion collection is part of my life without it being kind of a phony part of my life or, a forced part of my life, because it is about storytelling, but it's what you wear telling stories. Whereas my house is surrounded by pieces that tell my story, but also tell a story of perhaps that decade or that century or the country from which it originated.
Sarah and I were talking earlier today about how important we think it is to live a creative life, so that everything that you do, the clothes that you wear, your environment, the food that you cook, the things that you do in your everyday are a natural expression of your creative soul.
Yeah, and I'm sure as we all are, and especially with you two as being authors, it makes your stories even richer, because you have all these incredible experiences of storytelling that aren't actually words on paper, but you can add your stories to the words on paper.
Beautiful. So we have made the most deluxe English high tea for you. Let us surprise you. Come and have a look at what we've done.
I'm excited.
Charlotte, you inherited this extraordinary collection of clothes from your Quaker godmother. Can you tell us a little bit more about her and what she was like and how she came to have this amazing collection and how she came to give to you?
So how this whole thing came about in a tiny, like a hazelnut nutshell, is that my mother was a very good tennis player in England, hence why we have all this English furniture and English teapots and things like that. So my mother was a tennis player. She played against an American woman in Plymouth, England, at a competition. It would have been probably late 1940s. In England, you could not leave the country and go elsewhere unless you were sponsored. So this woman, and of all chances, my name being Charlotte Smith, this woman's name was Deborah Smith. And Deborah Smith said, come over, we'll sponsor you as a family. So this family, the Smith family, Deborah being my mother's new friend, they lived in Pennsylvania and they also lived in Bermuda. So my mother went to Bermuda as the partner, the tennis partner at the Coral Beach Club, which is one of the grand old hotels in Bermuda. And then when the family left there from the summer, they then went to Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania is Westtown School. And Westtown School is one of the most exclusive Quaker boarding schools in the country. And Doris Darnell, who ends up being my godmother, was the librarian there. And so Deborah, my mom's new tennis friend, got my mother a job at Westtown School. And of course, Doris Darnell, being one of these really warm, embracing, gorgeous women, said to my mother, I'll look after you. And then, introduced her to my father, who was there for a lecture about bird watching, a long story. So that's how it happened. So that's why, and Doris said that, the Quakers don't believe in God. They believe in the Spirit of God. And so Doris said that she loved the idea that she was probably the only Quaker of her generation who was a godmother. Of the 5,000 pieces that my godmother collected, every single piece was given to her. And that is what makes my collection extraordinary, because I've got the stories about the women who wore the clothing, or something about the family in the decades, so that it's not just a fashion collection. And what I say is that my collection is recording social history as well as a women's journeys through fashion. So it's not just a fashion collection.
So Charlotte, I so enjoyed reading One Enchanted Evening, and my favourite part about it was the individual stories. Some of them were funny, some of them were romantic, and some of them actually brought a bit of a lump to my throat, were quite poignant. I was just wondering how you chose the stories.
It was difficult, because we had to make sure that the dress was visually beautiful for Grant to illustrate, as well as the story being great. And if we didn't have a story, we didn't want to knock the dress out. So I decided to choose something about maybe the designer of the decade. But in the end, you have to be quite, with 10,000 pieces in the collection, you have to be quite ruthless in what you include. So, so I chose things, I tried to choose things that, when you looked at the whole book, you had a really lovely balance. So between, a love story, or a woman with empowerment and there was no man involved, or, maybe something, a mother-daughter story, or about, a woman designer who was beating all the odds and doing something. So this time I think I had a lot more flexibility than in my other books, where we were just kind of making it, just a beautiful, rather sugary, but, well-researched story. So this one was fun because I could choose anything, and also we kept it to the 20th century and the 21st century rather than including the 19th century.
As we're talking about the timeline, there's examples from every decade. And I was just wondering, what was your favourite decade of fashion?
Oh my gosh. Well, I suppose my favorite decade for story and history versus a decade where I love the clothing more. It would probably be the 1900s. I love that decade because, for me, I'm ambassador for a charity called Dress for Success Sydney, which is all about empowering women back into the workforce so they can be, financially independent. And, the 1900s to me was a very important decade where women started, of course, with the suffragettes and women designers who were making a living out of their career, like Lucille, Lady Duff Gordon, and, of course, Chanel. And so, for me, as a woman, I find it a very important decade. And also on top of that, the luxury of the clothing that was coming out from the Belle Epoque was extraordinary, and that was true haute couturier designs coming out. So history-wise, it would be 1900. Whereas I think fashion-wise, I love the 70s, and the 70s is much maligned with the the afros and kind of the weird colors that men had to wear. But for women, it was very 1930s, very kind of cut on the bias, very slinky, very sexy. You think of the discos and things like that. So and for me personally, I love the 70s. I'm wearing 70s today, matter of fact. A little tunic top that would have been worn at the beach. It's by, Miss Jansen. So I love the 70s because of the fabrics and because of the kind of fluidity of the designs. You weren't kind of cinched into corsets, and you weren't in mini dresses, which meant you couldn't sit down and things like that. So for me, I look at it both from a historical perspective as well as, the actual fashion, the actual clothing perspective.
Yes, well, in honour of today, I also decided to wear something from the 90s. This is vintage Lindsay Willis.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah, she was sort of very popular around Paddington back in the 90s.
Yeah. And that's really interesting too, to find fashion that its story is very niched in a particular area, because with my collection I'm so used to designers that it says made in Italy. Well, made in Italy, it could be anywhere in Italy.
Yeah,
you kind of imagine. But to think that you've got something that came from one very specific area of Sydney, I think I find really fascinating. Yeah. It's fabulous.
So yes. fashion has changed so much over the years as well. That story just reminds me of the fact that my grandmother used to be a seamstress, and she used to make the most beautiful, delightful clothes. And people used to, even me when I was young, I used to make clothes. I used to go through and look through patterns and look for gorgeous materials, but now very few people do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I always say that, you know, I'm probably the only person in the world who owns a collection of fashion, and I can't sew, and I don't want to learn how to sew because, you know, I look at it as just one more aspect that I have to then do, and it's just enough. But I have piles of things that need just a single button done, and yet, you know, I completely appreciate, you know, your story, because I mean, I wouldn't have these clothes if there weren't women who love sewing, and who, I mean, there are many designers in the collection whose mothers and their sewing interests and their skills inspired them as designers to then go on, and you know, that's Valentino and it's Balenciaga and people like that. So, you know, that hand sewing, which used to be so dowdy sounding, and
well, they used to call them seamstresses. Now they call them fashion designers. Like my grandmother could whip up a design like that with the most amazing cut, and I was so spoilt she could crochet and knit and sew, and I had the most incredible clothes as a 5-year-old in the 60s. And, like crocheted green dresses and black mini skirts with diamond tights and
oh my gosh,
berets.
Sounds funny. But that's something that I learned, because I actually, in my first book, Dreaming of Dior, I mentioned a designer, or I mentioned someone who sewed in a dress being in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and I called her a seamstress. And I actually had people writing me and saying that I was being very rude, because a seamstress was the one who kind of sat there and did the stitching and the hemming and things like that. The dressmaker,
mantua maker,
that was the head, the leader, which of course the dressmaker is now called a fashion designer. And that was really interesting, and I never knew that.
It is just these little interesting points of nomenclature, and what they mean, because we often lose those meanings over the years as well.
We do. Yeah, and I think now, you know, everything has to be totally, everyone has to have this sort of weird title to their name. So instead of just being a telephone operator, you're now, you know, a something, something, something. Whereas, you know,
telephonic operations.
yes, that's exactly right. And so, you know, a dressmaker or a seamstress kind of covered the whole thing, whether you were the pattern maker, whether you were the cutter, whether you were the embellisher or the embroiderer. You know, that was like the whole gamut. Whereas now everyone has an individual thing, which, you know, is fair enough. I mean, if I were an embroiderer, I would want to be acknowledged for that, because that's what is my role. Versus just being, you know, I don't want to be lumped in with the pattern makers, because they have their own other roles.
So one last question from me, and it's a biggie. You spoke earlier about the fashion being a sort of a record of social history.
Yeah.
What is fashion to you? What is the big question? Why does it play such an intrinsic role in our social history? Why are women so and men so fascinated with fashion as humans?
And it's certainly one that's being asked a lot now. I think fashion identifies us as women. It identifies us as to where we live, what part of society in which we move, what perhaps age we are, what we feel is currently trendy. And I think now, you know, now that fashion has become so important in defining us, so that when we go for job interviews, when we maybe meet our potential partner or something, people do sum you up. And I mean, whether first impressions are not important, because I mean, I am a big person of first impressions, because that's instantly what I think, and then I enjoy getting to know people, but it's first impressions. And I think what's happening now is fashion is our identity, and you know, we might not think that it is our identity and it's that important, but you know, you're both wearing fabulous outfits. You know, what I decided to wear today, I wanted this to represent me, you know, when I was being interviewed by you. So I don't know why I chose it, But, you know, because I didn't have time to think about it. But I mean, again, why you both chose your things. We were talking about vintage, so you chose something fabulous that, you know, tells a story about vintage and your, you know, appreciation of vintage. Your beautiful dress, I don't know, it's florally, it's beautiful, it reminds me of something maybe from China, maybe like a Cheongsam kind of a pattern. You know, who knows why we choose things, but it is our identity. And oftentimes people get caught up with labels and brands, and they feel that by wearing Chanel or wearing by Ralph Lauren or something where you've got a big logo is going to be their identity. Yet that is a brand identity, which of course is identifying their interest and their importance in brands. But again, it's summing them up. It's sort of, you know, my Zara trousers, my Chanel shoes, my Chanel, you know, I like that combination, and that tells that hopefully somebody that I might be interested in vintage and fashion, but I can tell my own story with a combination. This is a little bit of my Aladdin's cave. So here are my shoes. There are 121 pairs of shoes in here.
Wow.
Wow. So these are pieces that many of them I can wear. So this dress is probably about $30,000 we're looking at right now.
Oh,
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
So I do keep a few things that are, you know, should be down in my climate control, but I keep them here.
Right.
I'm just going to put that there so I can show you some more. Then I've got this one. It's pretty special. This one is the cover of the book, One Enchanted Evening.
Oh yes, that's
So
I love
gorgeous,
that.
isn't it?
Look at the
so
print.
this one is, you know, quite
Was
gorgeous.
that 1980s?
No, actually it's not. It's 2011.
Yeah, because remember the little bustles and everything?
Yeah.
I love that
Popular in the
bustle.
80s.
Yeah.
But you know, this was all when he was going back to his Spanish roots, and he was looking at the flamenco inspiration, and the red rose was the one
so
that
beautifully in the body, wouldn't it?
it would move, and then the red rose is symbolic, or the red carnation-y idea was the when they would throw the red carnation into the bullfighting ring when they were about to start the bullfight. So
I love it.
So that's quite
I love it.
gorgeous.
It's
and
gorgeous.
yeah, here we go. Here are two very precious gowns, including this one, which is in my book, and these are both by the American designers under the label Road Art. So
Yes, I recognise this one. That was the one that was based on Vincent van Gogh, Starry, Starry Nights.
yep, that's right. And then this one is, of course, on the sunflowers.
Yes.
And that's what I love, is the fact that we can be looking at a priceless piece of fashion, yet it's referencing art, and that gives it more integrity.
It does, doesn't it? Well, fashion is art.
It
It's
is.
fashion.
Yeah, exactly right.
On that note, Charlotte, we want to say thank you so much. This has been an absolute delight. We've enjoyed the food, the fashion, the shoes.
Yeah.
It's like spending an afternoon in heaven.
Good. Well, and for me, it's fun to share my stories and what I have here at the house, and in the whole history about my collection with people who appreciate, you know, fashion as well as storytelling. So thank you for, you know, inviting me to be part of your conversation.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to Word of Mouth TV. This is the time when we get to talk about books and where our authors tell us about the best books that they've read lately. Now, I will kick it off. I thought this book was very appropriate for this occasion with fashion. This is an oldie but a real goodie. It's Auntie Mame. It was made into two movies. I believe Lucille Ball and Rosalind Russell both starred as Mame in two productions, and it's just a fantastic book. It's about a young boy who has to go and live with his gin-swilling socialite aunt, who is completely unconventional, and he has just the most marvellous time growing up in her household. And there's a great quote out of this. Mame says, "Life is a banquet and so many people out there are starving." And it's a classic, you have to read it.
So my book I've chosen is called The Riviera Set. It's only just come out. It's about the 1920s and 30s in the south of France. It's about Maxine Elliott, who buys the chateau, a massive chateau in on the south of France.
One of
and
our
invites-
dreams.
Yes, and invites everybody. And she tells the stories, and the author, Mary Lovell, tells the stories about Winston Churchill coming, Ali and the Aga Khan coming, Rita Hayworth, all the different people who come to visit her in the chateau, and then how they go and buy other chateaux around the area in the 20s and 30s. So if you want that Art Deco glamour, if you want a bit of history about the south of France, and if you want a celebrity story told in a beautiful way, this is a fabulous book.
But for me, the book that I have chosen to talk about this week is The Wardrobe Mistress by Megan Masterson. And the reason why I've chosen this book is because it's about a young woman who becomes the wardrobe mistress to Marie Antoinette in the lead up to the French Revolution. And as we all know, Marie Antoinette had a wardrobe that almost equals Charlotte's.
Oh,
And
right. Good
can you
company.
imagine what an amazing job it would have been to dress Marie Antoinette in the years before the French Revolution? It's an absolutely wonderful book. I enjoyed it enormously. So that's my recommendation today.
And of course, the next thing that we talk about are our favourite cookbooks. And this is one that came out about 20 years ago, and it was a huge fad. The media made a big thing about it. It's called French Women Don't Get Fat. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but there seems to be a lot of anecdotal evidence to support it. But basically it has this woman, she goes to America and starts eating a lot of donuts. She's French, of course, and when she goes back, she has to go to the doctor, who puts her on a diet of leek soup for a week, and and all the recipes in here are quintessentially French, but also apparently bound to help you take off those kilos.
I might have to borrow that book.
So I cooked a few of these, and I don't know that I've lost any weight, but I did enjoy the food.
So I chose a book that brings back a few memories of my life, my former life when I was in Australia, when I lived the grand social life in the 80s in New York City. So it's as grand and as opulent as you can imagine the parties I frequented. So I chose it. It's by Rizzoli, and they always do beautiful books, also a New York company. And you know, everything. I mean, it's just fabulous how they've kind of told the stories of food towards, you know, decor, like that one, the 50s cocktail
50s
party.
cocktail.
I know. And so just splendid is all I can say. So yeah, this brings back memories as I'm cooking my my leek soup tonight to lose weight, but instead of eating foie gras on toast. But anyway, it's wonderful to have, and it certainly brings back memories.
So the cookbook that I've chosen to share this week is called 12, a Tuscan cookbook. I often buy cookbooks because of their beauty as much as for what's inside them, and this is a particularly beautiful one. It's got lots and lots of big colour photographs and really gorgeous pictures of Tuscan children enjoying their food. I really love just to sit down and look at the pictures and be inspired. Imagine I'm in Tuscany and that I live this way. So it's a book about dreaming of living in Tuscany. Thank you so much for joining us on Word of Mouth TV with our special sound bites where we talk about the books that we've loved most recently. And thank you so much to Charlotte Smith for joining us and for sharing your 2 books with us as well. Thank you and bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been such a gorgeous afternoon. We've had a lovely, lovely time. And thank you to all of you out there for joining us once again on Word of Mouth TV.
Thank you for joining us. And if you don't want to miss any of our shows, just press the subscribe button at the bottom of our YouTube channel.
And if you want to know more about our fantastic giveaways,
Or about any of our delicious recipes,
or book news, views and reviews,
then just go to our website at wordofmouthtv.com.au.
see you next time!